Deepin is a real model that creates cost efficiencies, lowers prices for consumers, deploys capital faster and infrastructure faster, and it just makes it better than other centralized infrastructure deployment models. Energy is the sleeper sector because if you're like not really deep into Deepin, you don't have any idea what's going on there. You can scale much faster being a digital resource network than a physical resource network. So if you could manage to get it right and get the tech out, I think you could capture a lot of revenue and demand.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unleashing DePIN Podcast. My name is Tyler. I'm your host. And, I always say I'm really excited for guests to come on the podcast, and that is always true, but I am extra excited. I've been anticipating this guest. He is someone that's on the forefront of researching DePIN, definitely a thought leader. This is Dylan from Masari. Dylan, welcome on the Unleashing DePIN Pod. I'm happy to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
This is going to be good. I'm always looking to you for insights and novel information that I can't find elsewhere. We did a wrap up last year for 2023, going into 2024. I thought we got to keep that streak alive. You are the perfect person to talk to for DePIN in the new year. But before we jump into all of that, just maybe tell the folks who you are, what you do. I know you've got a show, you've got a podcast, you're talking to DePIN founders as well. We want to make sure we plug that. But tell the world about yourself and we'll get into it.
Yeah, so I'm a research analyst on the enterprise team at Masari. I cover primarily DePIN, but RWAs, infrastructure, and other projects as well as they come up. I host a few podcasts for our network, including Fully Diluted, where we interview founders and VCs and other types of investors, as well as the UO podcast, where we go deep into our reports at the cutting edge of what's going on in crypto and DePIN.
Yeah, Masari is certainly a household name. If you're not familiar, they are the go-to source for just researching the space. They've got quite a lot of great content. I know every year at Consensus, when your former CEO was speaking, I was keen to go listen to what he was sharing because it was always very valuable, very insightful. So before I want to go into all of the DePIN 2024, DePIN in the new year, I'm just curious, before you were at Masari, what were you doing? Like, how did you get introduced to crypto? Did you know about DePIN before you joined the org?
Yeah, so prior to Masari, I was at T. Rowe Price, which is a large asset manager in the US. They primarily focus on equities and fixed income, but they started up their digital assets division, as a lot of other large asset managers haven't, especially in America. So as one of their first people on the team, I worked primarily on tokenization, looking at RWAs, figuring out, can we create like indices and baskets of assets to potentially offer to clients down the road. So really looking at real world applications where efficiency can be found using blockchain technology and infrastructure. And I think this kind of led me in the direction of DePIN. So I've done various venture capital roles, that digital assets role over the year, worked at a real estate tokenization startup. And I think what I found is you're putting existing assets on chain, which has value in terms of upgrading efficiency and composability and creating more liquid markets. There's a lot of investment potential from an early stage, and it's also not extremely exciting and really at the cutting edge, where I think I find a lot more interest and value. I think with DePIN, which I think really emerged into the crypto ethos in like 2023, 2024 especially, I got that real world value, that real world utility, crypto finally having some real use cases beyond a more circular, decentralized nature. But there's like real projects being built from scratch or real businesses being built from scratch. There's so much new that just hasn't been figured out, so much that needs to be figured out, that I just found that there's immense opportunity there. So kind of transition from RWAs, which I think it's kind of dependent on regulations for the most part, to DePIN, which I think it's a wide open space where anyone can build.
Yeah, I love your explanation there, and I certainly agree and concur with your assessment with respect to tokenizing real-world assets versus building these new sort of physical infrastructure networks. And for those that maybe also don't know, your former colleague, I guess he might have been there before you were, was actually I think you took over his role, if I'm not mistaken, more or less. He kind of turned this DePIN term, so you guys are definitely pushing that forward. But all that aside, I'm excited to pick your brain a little bit about DePIN as a category. I think the first thing that I want to start off with is looking at 2024. This was a really explosive year where DePIN certainly I don't want to say dominated the crypto narrative, but it was certainly in that top 5 or 7 kind of sectors of interest. It's finally a category on CoinMarketCap, which is cool. And so we've had a lot of growth, a lot of investments, all that kind of good stuff. So I think the first place I'd love to start is, if we're looking back from 2024, what were the things that surprised you, the things that disappointed you, and maybe the things that exceeded your expectations, if you will, within the Deepin space for this last year?
Yeah, so I think going into 2024, there's a lot of excitement about Deepin. Like our last year's State of Deepin report, it's like one of our most viewed and popular reports on Masari's website. But I think the big question was, can we actually capture the demand side? Can we create real value, so to speak? Like, is Deepin just going to be this thing where we can bootstrap a bunch of infrastructure and resources off of that infrastructure, but that nobody wants? Or can we like actually create a real demand side and then grow real businesses out of that? So I think that was the big question mark going into 2024. And I think we've been able to answer that question, and the answer is yes. So I think Helium, especially with Helium Mobile and their carrier offload program, they've seen tremendous success just in their first year. So over 120K subscribers for Helium Mobile, lowest cost mobile, unlimited mobile data plan on the market at $20 a month. Carrier offload supporting 200,000 to 300,000 daily subscribers from the very largest telecom providers. So we see a real business being built. I think we're seeing 7 to 8 figure revenues for Helium Mobile already. And this is really just the foundation year. I think we're going to see crazy growth in 2025 and beyond. Then I think we've seen other protocols also capture revenue and demand. So like GeoNet managed to get the 7-figure annualized revenue and build basically the largest RTK network in the world, larger than any centralized competitor, using Deepin, real demand side. They have like an 80% buy and burn, where their foundation handles all sales and through wholesalers and various distribution channels, and then they burn 80% of that revenue and buy back their token. I'm also seeing Glow get a ton of revenue. I think it might be slightly misleading on what the revenue means, but it is real revenue coming in, and it'll create real downstream value accrual for token holders in the future. And then we've seen other, I'd say there's probably nearly 10, including Filecoin, potentially IO.net, Protea, and other Deepins that are also hitting 7-figure revenue. So these are real businesses being built, very early stage, but we can see Deepin is a real model that creates cost efficiencies, lower prices for consumers, deploys capital faster and infrastructure faster, and takes advantage of various decentralized properties through blockchain and existing infrastructure, and it just makes it better than other centralized infrastructure deployment models. So high level, I think we're seeing demand being captured, and that's what I'm most excited about. Disappointed? I don't know if I'm like necessarily disappointed. I think Deepin's done like tremendously well across categories. I think maybe we're seeing a lot of projects attach themselves to the Deepin narrative that might make some people question what Deepin really is. I myself don't have a huge issue with this because I think Deepin's still nascent. Most people have never heard of Deepin, and I think there's more value to gain from building the narrative, building the idea, having real-world utility attached to this Deepin moniker than just being very hyper-specific about what kind of protocols can be considered Deepin. So it's kind of a trade-off in that you don't want projects that might be a little scammy or just trying to attach to something that's actually good with Deepin, diluting the brand, but you also want to get a lot of projects increasing the awareness of what Deepin is and growing the sector within crypto.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would concur with your assessment on all of these things. It's been amazing to watch the demand side capture actually materialize. I know this has always been the big question mark looming over crypto. One of the things that I've been researching and trying to understand a lot is, how do we look at potential for demand side? I think it's still, as you mentioned, it's nascent, but we know that it's viable. It's just how that continues to grow in 2025 will be amazing. One of the other things that I've been fascinated by is this term Deepin, if you will. It really started there was always projects like Filecoin or LivePeer that predated this Deepin term. For me, it really came out of this early Helium, decentralized wireless, that expanded to more of a physical infrastructure network. And from there, we've seen sort of these new sectors or verticals within Deepin under the umbrella emerge. I think energy is one of the biggest ones that's sort of become top of mind considerations in that last time frame. If you were to look at the Deepin sector today, can you compartmentalize kind of the different verticals or sectors that exist underneath that? And do you think in the next year there will be new sectors that we're not talking about that'll be part of that DePIN conversation?
Yeah. So at Masari, we categorize DePIN broadly as physical resource networks and digital resource networks. And what that really means is physical resource networks are more location dependent for where the infrastructure is in terms of producing the underlying resource, while digital resource networks are mostly location independent. So under digital, we would see a lot of GPU compute networks, file storage, content delivery networks, database type DePINs, and basically more abstract. Some people call this DVIN, decentralized virtual infrastructure networks, but we've been running with that for a few years, so we stick with the DRN term. And physical resource networks are things like Helium, a lot of the energy DePINs, the DY protocols, more sensor collection DePINs like GeoNet, or like mobility or mapping like HiveMap or Demo, where it's more location dependent, it's more interacting with the real world as well. So that's how we categorize it broadly. And then we have a bunch of subsectors, which I've mentioned. I think the largest ones have probably been compute, wireless, and wireless so far. And yeah, I'd say file storage as well because of Filecoin. I think energy is probably the highest potential one, just because I think there's the largest addressable market and there's the most demand in terms of accelerating energy infrastructure development across any industry. So yeah, I'd say those are the major categories. I think also driving data has a lot of potential in terms of with autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles being developed and integrated into our existing vehicular systems. So those are the big ones. Emerging ones are all over the place. So like in our theses, we mentioned 3DOS in manufacturing. They do 3D printing where you can basically have anyone around the world produce a physical product locally and then distribute that more easily. There's content delivery networks, which I think are interesting, where they're decreasing latency through hyper-localized nodes and points of presences and trying to use like multicast type technology to kind of push forward what's possible using DePIN. And then I think within each category, there's also a lot of innovation. So then wireless, I'm very bullish on Dawn, which is a fixed wireless broadband network. They're trying to reduce the cost of at-home internet by 80 to 90%, and they think they can get equivalent speeds to fiber optics. So that's super exciting. I think a new protocol that's really cool is 00 coming out of the Solana Foundation. They're basically trying to build a new internet using fiber optic links and very complex. We'll see if it works, but in theory, they can filter a lot of the underlying traffic of public internet infrastructure, which can make block verification and validation much more easier. And they can also use DePIN to basically match this latent dark fiber optic supply, which is 60% of fiber in the US, to their network. So a very interesting approach that I'm excited about. So yeah, I'll stop there. I think there's a bunch of other things. Some people say consumer type DePINs that are more based on data, like Blackbird or DePINs. There's Puffpaw, which is vape to earn. I guess you could call that DePIN. But I think there's a ton being done on the data side as well, which we don't cover as much, but I think have some interesting use cases that can generate value pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear. The 00 project is not one. This is why we love having you on. You give us the alpha that we didn't know. This is a project that I haven't actually looked at, but it sounds really compelling. I'm gonna have to do a little bit more digging there. I know we were talking offline. You are in the process of building a report for kind of the DePIN space that'll be dropped soon with our friend Saul over at EV3. One of the things that we were chatting a little bit about was the kind of privacy market and while it's maybe not DePIN, it's DePIN adjacent, but that might be something that's interesting as a new category, a new sector within the space. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so there are protocols like anyone that are developing like somewhat decentralized VPNs. I haven't gone super deep into the VPN business, but you could argue they're not like truly masking your IP address, and that there's a lot of easy ways to overcome that if a larger attacker or government wants to see it. So projects like anyone are using DePIN, or at least DePIN adjacent elements to overcome that. We're actually planning on doing like a privacy roundtable with anyone and a few other of these projects in January, so stay tuned for that at Messari. I think it's a really compelling use case. Founders in this space are super smart. Communities are like very robust and something that might seem a little boring at first glance. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think a lot of people might just not be looking at it because it's not necessarily fits very cleanly into the DePIN category.
Yeah. What about ZKs? I know IoTeX just announced there's a project that's building ZKs that they're going to have intersect with the DIDs on the IoTeX network. Is that another, call it DePIN adjacent category that you have interest in, or that is part of the potential in the future?
Within ZK, I think there's a ton of different applications. A lot of DePINs have looked at are ZK TLS applications. So this is zero knowledge travel layer, I think, security. Releasing a report on that pretty soon, actually. But basically, the idea is that if you want to build like a decentralized Uber or DoorDash, like Nosh or Teleport are trying to do, you need to have very good data on drivers. It's very difficult to coordinate all this Uber code in terms of validating the safety of drivers and their quality. And you can use these ZK-TLS applications to basically vampire attack larger existing Web 2 applications and just basically take all their drivers if they want to join your program. You can validate that the rating's real and all of that without knowing the underlying information and all that. You just have a ZK proof proving that they meet a certain criteria. And this could have a large range of downstream potential applications within DePIN. I think there's a lot of controversy whether this will work really, and there's other hurdles that need to be overcome first. I think there's definitely a lot of promise. I think a lot of VCs are investing very heavily in ZK TLS, and even if it's not something that DePINs can really use directly, I think there's very valuable use cases in terms of building on-chain identities, which you can create credit scores with down the road, maybe do under-collateralized lending, and just have your Web3 presence fully validated by the real world without having to reveal any of that information. So I think that's a very promising application of ZK, and because DePIN interacts with the real world so much, like there will clearly be ZK integrations in some form in the future.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about that. I'm definitely excited about your privacy roundtable. It's something that I hold near and dear to my heart. I love the privacy space. Moving from 2023 to 2024, there was a lot of excitement, a lot of interest. We knew that we could bootstrap supply. The question became, can we bootstrap demand? That's been validated to some degree this last year. What do you think is going to be different in 2025 compared to this year in terms of expectations, in terms of new projects coming onto the market or project growth? Like, how are you forecasting the next year of DePIN to look?
Yeah, so I'm extremely excited about 2025 just because I think there's so many catalysts for growth and just good things happening. So first, we had tons of startups emerge in 2024 in DePIN. So I think fundraising rose like 300% year over year compared to 2023. All these startups were mostly building, maybe not in the mainnet yet. Like you might have seen them on Twitter, social media, but not much interaction, not much possibility to get involved. Most of these I think are going to launch their primary product or beta in 2025. So we're going to see an explosion in actual DePINs coming to the market. So for those are like the earliest stage DePINs, and a lot of these are very innovative. I think then for DePINs that kind of launch products in the last few years, we're going to see them kind of move from the bootstrapping stage a bit more into the scaling stage. So they've validated their demand, their model. I think especially something like Helium could scale into millions of Helium mobile subscribers next year, for example. Things like Glow could get $1 billion plus in solar panel revenue deployment from their model. And I think we'll see GPU compute networks as well grow to some capacity, even if there's going to be some competitive elements that might slow that down. So I think we're going to see a lot more demand. We're going to see a lot more revenue. We're going to see a lot more of these protocols coming to market. I also think we might see a large government partnership or integration or initiative with DePIN. So GeoNet had a partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture last year to do high precision farming. I think you look at the new AI crypto czar, David Sachs, he's known to have held or hold HNT, Render, Honey from HiveMapper. He's a big Solana investor. I think the incoming administration wants to highlight real world utility from crypto because I think that's one of the large arguments that will be made against various policies like the strategic Bitcoin reserve, eliminating capital gains taxes. The crypto just has no value. And I think DePIN's an easy way that's intuitive for anyone to understand to show this is real value being created with crypto. So I could also see that I don't know if there'll be some kind of wireless initiative to expand connectivity in rural areas or maybe accelerate energy infrastructure deployment. I don't know what it might be. It might just be a formal exploration for the future, but I think we'll see something like that as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, knowing that the government, there's a potential for government interest or intersections is always a big thing. It's been the looming concern over the United States crypto industry. So having at least more clarity around what we can do moving forward, and even an administration that's going to be supporting it. You mentioned David Sachs and his investments within the space, if you will, or he's a holder within the space. It certainly shows some promise. But yeah, I think 2025 is going to be great. I have sort of a rapid fire list of questions within Deepin that I want to ask you about. And this sort of translates into how we're going to look at the year ahead. The first thing is wireless. You mentioned Helium Mobile was a real catalyst for consumer adoption in 2024. You mentioned they've scaled over 100,000 subscribers. In 2025, do you think wireless will be the category that leads consumer adoption, or do you think there will be another sector in Deepin that has a higher chance of capturing the mainstream consumer market?
I think it will be wireless. I think Helium in particular has the foundation now, as well as the resources. Nova Labs, they have hundreds of millions in their war chest. I think they're best positioned. They have the partnerships, they have the reputation, they have the relationships, they have a proven model. So just from Helium alone, I think we'll see the most consumer adoption. We also going to see Dawn coming to market. I think they have very large potential to capture a lot of demand and consumers. Carrier One, really, Roam, these other wireless networks as well as these like more Wi-Fi oriented ones. I think they stand the best chance to gain the greatest amount of consumers and users, and I think ultimately demand side dollar value. So I think that's almost a no-brainer. I think energy has more potential in terms of TAM, but I think it's still very early. I think a lot of it's very experimental, seeing what works, and I don't think you really reach escape velocity in 2025. Compute, we'll see. I don't think it'll be at the level of wireless. I think one of my big issues with compute is I think a large AI company that's centralized can come in, just build a Deepin type thing that they get bootstrap latent GPU supply and then integrate that into their larger model and have much more competitive advantages than these other pure Deepin GPU networks. Driving, potentially, if we think about Demo and Nadix and HiveMapper, there is a large demand side here. They're starting to capture it. I think we saw HiveMapper get a lot of value pretty recently. But again, I don't think they can match what something like Helium or Dawn can do next year.
Interesting. I think I generally agree with what you're saying there. I'd love to see Helium Mobile hit 1 million subscribers. They might get there with this free teaser that Amir posted yesterday. I don't know what that alpha is, but we will see. The other question I was curious to get your insights on was I saw Saul actually yesterday. He tweeted the chain migration from Polygon, some other chains, basically to Solana and Base. And then also we've had Deepin L1s. Peak notably had their launch this year. IoTech's been around for a little bit. So I'm curious on, number one, your thoughts around Deepin L1s as just a category. And then more generally, what is your chain outlook for 2025 for projects launching? Do you think it's going to be on Base? Do you think it's going to go on Solana? Does it not really matter? Just curious to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, so I addressed this partially in our theses, which just released. And basically, I think Solana's been the runaway winner in terms of Deepin adoption over the last years. We've seen large migrations from Render and Helium and others. We've seen most Deepins just build natively on Solana. And I think a lot of it is just Solana had low costs, low transaction fees, high TPS. And then they had a very strong BD team that was welcoming to a lot of these Deepins, whereas a lot of other BD teams didn't really know what Deepin was and were like, oh yeah, you can build here if I guess. So Solana, through that, became the primary winner of Deepin. That being said, I think a rival will emerge in 2025 to Solana. Maybe not match it, but I think we'll contend with it. And I think there's really 3 or so options. I think it's going to be either Base on the L2, or it's going to be a Deepin specific L1 like Peak or IoTex. or it could be a combination. And the reason is, I think on the Deepin specific L1s, they can get very deep in the weeds of these founders. They can provide support that Solana can't quite provide the same level. They're building their network in view of Deepin. So the architectural decisions they'll make, every decision they'll make is in the view of Deepin's, whereas Solana has to take a more consolidated, generalized view, which might not appeal as much to the specific Deepin projects. Furthermore, I think it might be easier to create composability and interoperability and make these Deepins work together on Peak or IOTEX or on a Deepin specific L1. I think Peak has a very compelling machine economy thesis with robots and all kinds of crazy real world interactions. And I think there are certain projects that might buy into that vision and want to build there. And then I think Base is maybe the highest potential competitor to Solana. I think Sal himself, and we haven't even actually discussed this yet between us, but he showed a duopoly forming between Base and Solana. And I think Base is just becoming the clear runaway winner in terms of what's the best UX, DevX, consumer type infrastructure, underlying blockchain infrastructure to build on in Ethereum. It's clearly Base, and there's really no competition. So Base is, again, the Solana of Ethereum, and it also has a very large advantage in its integration of Coinbase. If you're looking for enterprise clients, relationships, distribution channels, Coinbase is no better partner in crypto. So I think that's probably its primary advantage over Solana, if they have roughly equivalent, UX, DevX, and consumer experiences. So Base is probably the biggest threat that I think could emerge to Solana in 2025 or beyond.
Yeah. Okay. That is really interesting. And we're seeing projects like Demo, like Daylight, really doing the full switch and really pushing the Base narrative. So I'm personally very interested to see how projects evaluate that. And I also would agree that there's very little drive or interest to go on another Ethereum L2 when you're looking at it in comparison to something like Base. So outside of chain stuff, one of the other questions I had was sub-DAOs. There's been quite a bit of conversation this year around Helium, specifically with the sub-DAO model. And we had the Helium Foundation team on the podcast. We were talking about this network concepts. And then with the recent challenges that we witnessed with the mobile sub-DAO and the IoT sub-DAO, just created kind of almost like a 180 in terms of how we were looking at that. But I'm curious if you think a sub-DAO style governance framework will persist in 2025, or if you think the days of that are over, generally speaking.
You mean specifically for Helium or throughout?
Specifically with Helium or with other networks that might be evaluating that, where they are, if you think of someone like GeoNet, when they're having integrations with projects like Wingbits, will they create potential sub-DAOs for other networks that are interfacing or integrated in some capacity?
Yeah, I think my view is that the sub-DAO model isn't really gonna end up panning, or if it does, it's just gonna be because there's this one large overarching Deepin, which has captured everything, and everyone's just building within there for whatever reason. But I don't think that's gonna happen at this point, just because Deepins are so different, and I think there's too much that needs to be built, and Deepins will get too far along where they wouldn't consider just being under that one large model. So I think Helium's moving away from the sub-DAO model in general. I think Helium Mobile has just been so successful that doesn't really make much sense to focus on it beyond that and the existing IoT. So the energy subnet passed in August. I think they've basically abandoned that with Sourceful. Even I think Sourceful's still involved with Helium, but I don't think they're actively developing an energy subnet. I think it makes sense to just double down on Helium Mobile, get rid of this complicated scheme of all these sub-DAO tokens, just one token that can accrue more value. People understand what's going on. It's easier to build a narrative. It's easier to sell to investors. It's easier to sell to funds, so they know what's going on and they don't get, a bit, I guess, turned off by this complicated model that they don't quite get. So I think we're just going to see one, not centralized, but not these sub-DAO models, which I think are just too confusing and convoluted before you have real large multi-billion-dollar businesses or Deepins already built as your main focus. And I think maybe down the road, Helium goes back down the sub-DAO model, but I just don't see much of a point in diverting resources there and attention when they have a runaway hit with Helium Mobile, and I think other DePINs are more likely to be successful in what they're building right now, and Helium doesn't really need to worry about that.
Yeah. I think that makes good sense. I'm curious about your thoughts on the DePIN compute space. Do you think there is too much fragmentation specifically in that sector?
Yeah, I think at Masari, like we've generally had a less favorable view for the outlook of compute networks than others. Like there are obvious cost benefits, but it seems like supply is starting to catch up with demand. We will need a lot more supply, but there's so much trillions of dollars invested in this that I'm not sure it's a major bottleneck in AI. So sure, like you can tap into latent GPUs or whatever, but it's not like very clear how each of these networks differentiate themselves. Like they're all kind of offering the same thing. Like some are more enterprise focused, some are more consumer focused, some are focused on gaming. But at the end of the day, I don't think it makes a big difference. And I think there's a race to the bottom for a commodified, like undifferentiated resource or undifferentiated approach to providing these resources. And I just don't see how they can create a better product and offering than a centralized company. So I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think it's like I think a large centralized AI company will build some kind of DePIN for GPU compute, and that they'll just dominate this space, and that other networks are gonna have a very hard time competing with that. But again, we need what, trillions of dollars worth of GPU compute. Who knows? There is a reason GPU compute has had the most new DePINs started this year, and we could very well be wrong. There could be ways to capture certain niches, but we're not optimistic about that.
Okay, that's good to know. It is, from an outsider perspective, really this race to the bottom consideration has been, in my opinion, the driving factor as to why there'll be some challenges there. So it's always nice to know that's substantiated by the Masari team. You talked about this a little bit with respect to DePIN L1s like Peak, who have a competitive advantage where the interoperability between projects is really a selling point. Most of the projects we've had on who have been building on Peak or are interested in building on Peak, that's been a driving factor for them. But in 2025, do you think we will see more DePINs building on other DePINs compared to what we have today with projects like HiveMapper, who's leveraging the Helium network in some capacity, or Wingbits, who's building on GeoNet? Do you think there will be more of those types of integrations in the new year?
I certainly hope so. I think that is actually one of the big unlocks of crypto and blockchain is that composability, is that interoperability, and that's like how you really completely eviscerate Web 2 models and that you can create this compounding value of composability. Will we see more of that? Probably. I think like we are seeing some initial models. I don't know if anyone's really figured out what's the best way to do this, but I think we're going to see more of it, and the most successful ones will validate it, and then I think that'll be replicated across the board in terms of how do you do integrations. And I think a good thing is, like you said, like Wingbits is not really competitive with GeoNet, so it can leverage its platform. I think in Web 2, if you're going to do like any kind of partnership, it's very expensive. It's a ton of engineering. It's a lot of legal. And blockchain DePIN, it's much more easier to do that. So I think like the barriers to that are much lower. And I think that will make that much more likely. But I couldn't point to a lot of specific partnerships or interoperability that I think will emerge. I think everything is so early stage and focused on validating their own model that trying to leverage other DePINs at this point isn't the highest priority. And we are seeing some partnerships. And I saw Daylight and Nadix do a partnership recently. GeoNet's partnered with a bunch, but I don't know if we'll see anything extremely substantive in 2025. And I'd look more towards the following years.
Okay. Do you think there will be some form of DePIN M&A in 2025? You know, you talk about projects like Wingbits building on GeoNet. They've got this dual miner that is shipping in January. But do you think we'll see some form of DePIN M&A happening in the new year?
I doubt it, but I think there's a lot of potential for it in the future. I've heard a ton of creative models for like private equity funds investing in DePIN and credit funds and even M&A type deals. I don't know if it like really makes much sense at this point. Like I'm sure there's potential, but I think generally when you're doing M&A, you want a more mature business on one side of the transaction. And I'm not sure if like I'd see any business that stands to gain a lot. Like maybe bigger ones like Helium could, But again, like I think Helium wants to double down instead of getting too much in the weeds with complex partnerships and acquisitions. And there's a lot of fees here when you're doing M&A. There's a lot of complications. I know like the crypto native investment banks, they're definitely looking towards that. We saw some interesting ideas like an Arbitrum M&A fund earlier in the year where the DAO would do M&As to improve Arbitrum's ecosystem. And that could be interesting from a DePIN standpoint. I think what would be more likely is an outside fund, independent of a DePIN, does a bunch of M&A and tries to create synergies in various ways. And I think it would be complex, but there would be definitely alpha there if you do figure it out and put in the effort. But I think it's still too early. I think that's something probably looking more towards the latter end of the 2020s.
Yeah. What about in sectors where there's not a lot of variability between product offerings, like the compute market, for example? Do you think there's a higher potential for those types of sectors to see maybe not like a true M&A approach with a private equity fund, but a merger and network so that their competitive advantage can be predicated on larger and larger supply resources?
Yeah, I think it's possible. The challenge there is the switching costs. Like, do you really lock in these GPUs to your network? Unclear if any of these networks really have so far. So I'm not sure if there's like much like value in terms of bringing them all in. It's not guaranteed that these networks stay, that the underlying users stay together. And I don't know if there's like actually much capturable value from being larger in that way for the underlying token holders as well. So I don't know. I think it's possible that it does happen just because there are a lot of these networks I think are going to collapse and are going to look for any exit. So maybe they try to merge or like someone tries to acquire them for various reasons. That's not an impossibility, but I don't know if that like really ends up creating much value in the long run for this sector.
Okay. That's interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I've got two final rapid fire questions for you. The first is, and this is not financial advice, but is there a specific project that you think has the highest propensity to create the next milestone of top revenue for 2025? You talked about it a little bit with Helium Mobile potentially, but is there a project that you're looking at that you think has the highest chance of creating the most revenue next year?
Yeah, Helium's definitely up there. I think Glow does as well. Like again, the value accrual is going to be very confusing without going pretty deep into the weeds, but they just have a model where a lot of value can just come in and it makes sense for very large funds to just throw hundreds of millions of dollars at it potentially. So I think that will have the most revenue next year, both top line and more down the line in terms of value accrual. I do think it will be Glow. I think, yeah, Helium, GeoNet, maybe some of these compute networks can get revenue. I don't know if it'll be sustainable there. I think Dawn will probably launch. I think they stand to capture a lot of value. Yeah, I'd mostly look there. I wouldn't see another protocol coming out of nowhere and capturing more revenue. I don't really see what it would be. Maybe something like 00 does because it has so much resources behind it and talent, but I'm not sure if that'll happen next year.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see. What is the sleeper sector of 25 that, in DePIN specifically, that is underrated today and will not be underrated next year?
I think broadly energy is the sleeper sector because if you're like not really deep into DePIN, you don't have any idea what's going on there. But it still has some level of attention. So I would say maybe the CDN networks. Like I think we've seen like Pipe, Blockcast emerge. I think they're very high potential. They have some technical questions that a lot of people are unsure about. But if they do make it work, they can supply the very largest media companies, distribution companies in the world. And you know, that's an absurd TAM. You can scale much faster being a digital resource network than a physical resource network. So if you manage to get it right and get the tech out, I think you could capture a lot of revenue and demand very fast. So I would say they might be the sleeper.
Okay. That's great alpha for us to continue looking at within 2025. Dylan, I know you've got some research reports that are coming out. We alluded to this a little bit earlier. You are a resource that everybody needs to be checking out if you are in DePIN or if you're just into crypto in general. Masari is definitely the leader. When can people expect that report? What else should people know? I know you've got a podcast that you do. I think it's weekly, right? more or less?
Yeah. So I'd say first thing, check out the 2025 theses from Masari. It's 190 pages or so. I wrote 30, 35 pages on Deepin. It's free. You can just, yeah, as long as you just sign up for Masari, you can access it. There'll also be a PDF pretty soon. I would go there. We're going to be releasing a very large State of Deepin report with EV3 early in January. We're actually going to be doing a Deepin week then. So we're releasing Deepin podcasts every day. It's going to be all Deepin themed, focused throughout our socials. And I think it'll be probably the best, most consolidated overview of Deepin that's around. So definitely check that out when it's out. That'll also be free. We're currently working on a ZK TLS report, which is Deepin adjacent. Definitely, if you want to see what's next in the space, look at that. And then we have a bunch of plans for 2024, still finalizing like our content calendar for Q1. So can't commit to what will be written yet, but expect some really cool reports. And yeah, podcast usually releases weekly. There'll be a bit of a lull with Christmas and the holidays, but starting back in January, you'll probably get a weekly Deepin podcast at Masari.
I love it. And you guys primarily focus on interviewing projects, right? Founders, having them on for people that maybe haven't seen it yet. That's really the theme of the podcast.
We look for mostly early stage Deepins that we think are the most promising that you probably haven't heard of. We talked to some established ones as well. We've had Helium on, we've had Demo on, but we want people to learn what we think is coming next, and that so that they can be as early as possible.
Okay, that's great. We are all about advancing the education within the Deepin space, so we want to be able to share that as much as possible. Dylan, final question that I want to sneak in, not Deepin related. Do you think the bull market is going to stay next year?
I think it will. I think there is a risk of a big pullback, especially around the inauguration and over the holidays. So, you might want to try to time that, you might not, but I think there will be a bull market continuing well into the year.
Okay. All right. So crypto's here to stay. Hopefully, Deepin is here to stay. 2025 looks bright. Dylan, I appreciate you coming on. This is always really fun for me to look at what's happened in the last year, see what's going ahead. You are certainly a person who should be paid attention to with respect to all of that research and deriving insights. So we really appreciate it. We will link all of that information down below with respect to your handles, obviously Masari, those various reports. So if you have not checked them out, you want to go follow Dylan, you want to go read up and watch because it will be worth your time if you are interested in the space. Other than that, Dylan, we wanted to thank you again for coming on. I think we'll wrap it up here, everybody, and we will plan on seeing you on the next one. Dylan, thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Take care.